Well, so we have a situation in Russia where Vladimir Putin is a evil dictator who's invading foreign countries, killing uh, Ukrainian babies and the hospital and Ukrainian soldiers, and of course killing his own soldiers in the process. And there's going to be a moment in time when this war ends, and it may very well end with the fall of the Putin regime. And if it does end with the fall of the Putin regime, there needs to be a new regime in Russia that's not hostile towards the West, that believes in democracy and free speech and good relations.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And this time we're catching up with the financier and political activist Bill Browder. He is the founder and CEO of Hermitage Capital Management and was the largest foreign investor in Russia until 2005, when he was banned from the country for exposing corruption. He now campaigns to impose sanctions against corrupt people linked to the Putin regime and to free political activists that have been imprisoned by it. Bill, welcome back to Frontline. Good to see you again. Unfortunately, we are meeting again in the light of some worrying news about the health of your friend and former colleague, Vladimir Kara-Murza, who was moved to prison hospital a few days ago. I'll ask you a bit more about that in a moment. Regular viewers will know who exactly he is, but could you just remind people or tell people who don't?
Sure. So, first of all, my whole claim to fame is that I'm often considered one of Putin's number one foreign enemies. And the reason for that is that after the murder of my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, back in 2009, I launched a campaign to get sanctions imposed on Russian officials, asset freezes and visa bans. That campaign was named after Sergei Magnitsky, and it led to legislation called the Magnitsky Act. And one of the key people who helped me get the Magnitsky Act passed was Vladimir Kara-Murza. Vladimir is younger than me. He's in his mid-40s. He's a Russian opposition activist and also a British citizen. And when I would go to different parliaments around the world to explain to them why the world needs a Magnitsky Act, he would go and explain on behalf of the Russian people why a Magnitsky Act was needed. And together, we made a very powerful case, and we succeeded in getting 35 countries to pass Magnitsky Acts. And in doing so, we completely changed the landscape for the Putin regime and many other dictators around the world. And all of a sudden, they had to start worrying about their assets getting frozen and their visas getting banned. And Vladimir Putin took this very badly. He sentenced me to 18 years in prison in absentia and has been chasing me around the world with Interpol arrest warrants and death threats and kidnapping threats. And Vladimir, when he was in Russia in 2015, he was poisoned and came within inches of dying. He was in a coma, multiple organ failure. And then they poisoned him again in 2017. And this was absolutely directly in retaliation for his work on the Magnitsky Act. And in 2022, when the war started, when Putin invaded Ukraine, Vladimir felt compelled to go back to Russia and to try to do whatever he could to rise up or raise public opinion against the war. And in doing so, within a day, he was arrested and sentenced to 25 years in what they call strict regime, which is like hard prison in Russia. And they've since sent him out to a prison in Omsk, Siberia, which is one of the worst prisons out there. And he's been now almost 280 days in solitary confinement. And Vladimir continues to suffer from the after effects of the poison, the assassination attempts that they made against him. He suffers from something called polyneuropathy, which means he can't feel his feet and hands, and has many other related health problems. And the doctors have said that he's not going to survive 2 years, let alone 25 years. And so we learned last week that he was abruptly taken to the prison hospital, and then he disappeared. And for about 7 days, we feared that he might very well have died. And thank God we discovered that he hadn't, that his lawyers were able to finally see him and that he's still alive. But the whole thing is just the most nightmarish, sadistic scenario you could imagine.
And what has the lawyer been able to say about his condition?
Well, he continues to be in what I would say bad condition. He's not in critical condition, but he's not well. Vladimir has lost about a third of his body weight, and he was not overweight to start with. He's like a skeleton. If you look at pictures of him, he's like a concentration camp victim. And of course, he has this progressive neurological disease. And what's interesting is under the Russian penal code, they say that a person with such a physical impairment shouldn't be in prison at all. I mean, it's part of their rules, but of course, they don't honor any of their own laws because if they did, he wouldn't be in jail in the first place.
Here in the UK, we have a new government, and you took that opportunity, and I presume the timing was absolutely right with his disappearance and his emergence in hospital, to write an article in the Telegraph newspaper where you made a direct appeal to the new Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, to do something about the situation. He's now replied, hasn't he, on Twitter? What did he say?
Well, he's basically saying that what he should be saying, and which is that the UK government demands his immediate release. We demand access to Vladimir, to healthcare, etc. The most important thing, and the reason I wrote this article, is that we've had a change in government. It took me a long time to raise Vladimir's case to the level of foreign secretary in the previous government. And Lord David Cameron was very good in advocating for Vladimir with allies, with the Russians, any way he could. And what my big fear was with the change in government that Vladimir would fall through the cracks, that there's so many things on David Lammy's new agenda as foreign secretary that he might not know that Vladimir is one of the most important issues on the agenda. And that's why I wrote the letter, and I was very pleased with his response. And I believe he's going to carry on and hopefully work even harder on getting Vladimir back.
Why do you say it is one of the most important issues on his agenda?
Well, so we have a situation in Russia where Vladimir Putin is an evil dictator who's invading foreign countries, killing Ukrainian babies in the hospital and Ukrainian soldiers, and of course, killing his own soldiers in the process. And there's going to be a moment in time when this war ends. And it may very well end with the fall of the Putin regime. And if it does end with the fall of the Putin regime, there needs to be a new regime in Russia that's not hostile towards the West, that believes in democracy and free speech and good relations. And Vladimir Kara-Murza is an opposition politician that represents all the things that we need in a Russian government, a peaceful Russian government, a Russian government that doesn't kill neighbors, that treats its own citizens with respect. And so as much good work as we're doing supporting the Ukrainians and fighting back on these evil dictator Putin and his regime, we also need to be supporting a very small number of people in Russia who want to lead Russia towards a peaceful path. And Vladimir is now, after the murder of Alexei Navalny, that leader. He's really the hope for the West in having some type of decent relationship with Russia in the future after the Putin regime is over.
A prisoner swap was ruled out earlier this year by a former foreign minister. David Lammy has replied within days of becoming foreign secretary. Have you got any indication that he might actually reconsider that earlier decision?
Well, he's been in the job 5 days so far, and so I don't think that I haven't had a chance to push on that, which I will for sure. But it doesn't necessarily require Britain. If Britain has a policy of not doing it, Vladimir is an international hero, not just a British hero. And for example, he was recently granted honorary Canadian citizenship, which is something they've only done 7 times before in their history. Nelson Mandela, Malala, a few others, and so the Canadians are interested. Vladimir's wife is an American citizen. His 3 children are American citizens. He is a permanent green card holder in the United States when he's not in Russia. The Americans are interested. Vladimir's mother is a German citizen. She lives in Berlin. The Germans are interested. And that's not to mention the Lithuanians and Norwegians and so on. And so I believe that when a prisoner swap finally gets organized, for a bunch of prisoners in Russia, that Vladimir should and will be included in that. And that's one of my main objectives, is to make sure that everybody understands that that we need to save this man's life. We saw what happened to Alexei Navalny. The same thing will happen to Vladimir if we don't save his life.
The brutality of Putin's Russia, which you know well, has been demonstrated very recently by this horrifying bombing spree on Ukraine this week. It included a children's hospital and a maternity centre in Kyiv. What response would you like to see from NATO allies to this? Would you like to see a direct response?
Well, so there's one thing which bothers me to no end, which is that the American government gives a lot of long-range missiles to Ukraine and tells Ukraine, though, you can't use them on Russian territory. So it's great that we're giving missiles to Ukraine, but to tell them that they have to fight with one hand tied behind their back is insanity. Russia is launching these bombs, the bomb that killed all these children in the cancer hospital, from Russia. How can you forbid them from hitting those targets? And so it seems just the most obvious thing in the world that, Russia deserves whatever it gets, and Ukraine should be able to fight in the most effective way possible. And there shouldn't be conditions placed on the Ukrainians in using the weaponry that they have to hit Russian targets. And these are military targets we're talking about. I'm not talking about civilian targets in Russia. I'm not saying an eye for an eye. No, but no Russian children should be murdered in the same way as Ukrainian children. I'm saying that Russian soldiers and Russian armament batteries and Russian arms factories, those things should be open for targeting by the Ukrainians, and the Americans and other countries that are putting restrictions on should lift those restrictions right away.
But there is some relaxation on that, isn't there? Because when the Russian offensive on Kharkiv was launched, the US did actually start permitting limited use of those weapons, and it does, and to just defend that particular area from attack, and that has been relaxed a bit more. And the UK government is now saying Storm Shadow missiles, literally just now, would be able to be used against targets inside Russia itself. So it does look like it's moving in the direction that Ukraine wants so badly.
I think it is, and this is sort of a classic development of this war. Everybody's sort of too little, too late. Those children would still be alive today if we hadn't put those restrictions on. And if you can remember, at the very beginning of the war, we said no tanks for Ukraine. No, that would be provocative. That might provoke Putin to do something more. And of course, Putin is provoked by weakness, not by strength. He's a mafia thug, and so when he sees us putting these restrictions on, he does more terrible things. The time that he doesn't do terrible things is when he sees that there's going to be a real material consequence to him of doing terrible things.
On the front line, it's estimated that Russia's suffering casualties of more than 1,000 soldiers a day, but is not making significant progress on the battlefield. How long do you think Russia and the Kremlin will allow Putin to continue to prosecute a war that's no closer to achieving its aims?
Well, the problem we have is that Russia is not a democracy. Public opinion doesn't matter. The losses that Russia suffers doesn't affect Putin in any kind of psychological way at all. And just put those numbers in perspective for a second. During the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which lasted 10 years, Russia, or the Soviet Union, lost 15,000 soldiers. The numbers, as you mentioned, are 1,000 a day right now. So in 15 days, they've suffered the same casualties as the entire invasion of Afghanistan. And the numbers, according to Ukrainian sources, are well north of 500,000 casualties, 500,000 dead Russian soldiers. But to answer your question about how long could it last, the answer is a long time, because Putin doesn't care. And remember, during the Second World War, Stalin sent 25 million Russians to their death. And so Putin has a great capacity for pain. And what Putin is hoping for, and he's probably not wrong in his own assessment of probabilities, he's hoping that Donald Trump will become the next president of the United States, that America will cut off funding for Ukraine, that from lack of resources, Ukraine's defenses will crumble, and that he'll finally succeed, even with all the casualties he's had to suffer. And if he does that, then from his perspective, it's been a great venture going into Ukraine. And from our perspective, it will be an absolute disaster, not just for Ukraine, but then Putin will be lining up and targeting the Lithuania or Estonia or Latvia or even Poland. And those countries are members of NATO. And then we have this terrible situation of, let's say Donald Trump is president. Will he honor the Article 5 of NATO? And I think based on his statements about NATO so far, he might very well not. If there's no more Article 5, then the question is, will Europe honor Article 5 without the Americans' help? And if not, then one of two things happen. Either we're directly at war with Russia without the Americans, or we're not. And Vladimir Putin runs roughshod all over former Soviet countries.
I mean, the NATO summit has just been taking place, 75th anniversary. Do you take any comfort in the kind of things that have come out of that?
Well, the NATO summit is a summit of democracies that are all in agreement. But the problem with these democracies that are all in agreement is that the leadership of these countries change. We saw what almost happened in France. Marine Le Pen, her party almost became in government, and it was only through a last minute horse trading that was prevented. She has publicly stated that she doesn't want to support Ukraine, and France is an important member of NATO. We mentioned Donald Trump. Of course, you've got Viktor Orban, who is a member of NATO and a member of the European Union that doesn't want to help Ukraine. And so the problem with democracies is that whatever is said today is great, but it may not be the same people saying it tomorrow, and they may be people with diametrically opposed views, which is what's so terrifying about the situation. Because we know that as long as Putin is alive, and he's going to make every effort to stay in power, and he's not going to change. So his view is the same, but there's any probability that one or many members of NATO may change in the future, and that's Putin's big bet: is that he can suffer losses, 100 times greater losses than we can, before we may very well fold with 1/100th of the pain that he's suffering, just because we're democracies.
Since we're talking about, you mentioned sort of membership of big global or contradictory memberships of big global organizations. Russia has taken over the presidency of the United Nations Security Council this month in July. It was set up to ensure global peace. And ironically, what does it do? It bombs a children's hospital in Kyiv. Russia's place is secure there because it's written into the UN Charter that permanent members are secure and have to agree a change in the Charter in order to be taken out in some way. Is the UN still fit for purpose?
The UN has completely compromised itself long before this Russia being head of the UN Security Council. You've got Saudi Arabia that's in charge of women's rights. You've got Venezuela and other countries on the Human Rights Committee. It's a complete farce at this point. It just doesn't work. It completely, in a certain way, the legitimacy of the United Nations covers up the atrocities so often of so many bad members, that there really needs to be a new architecture for peace and security, and the United Nations is not it.
There is an interesting report by Bloomberg claiming Saudi Arabia made a veiled threat over pursuing any proposals to seize that almost $300 billion worth of frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine, saying they'd sell some European debt holdings, and that this may have influenced the G7 to make a more conservative, still significant though, plan to use only the profits on those assets by way of a loan to help Ukraine. This has been denied by the Saudi Finance Ministry. Do you know anything about this?
Well, I've read the same article, and if it's true, it's total bluster. There's really Saudi Arabia doesn't have a lot of choices in terms of the types of assets it holds and currency it holds for its enormous profits from its oil sales. There's two basic currencies you can hold if you're that wealthy: dollars or euros. And so if Saudi Arabia wants to get out of the euro, that's absurd. It just doesn't work. And if what else are they going to do? They'll buy more dollars. Okay, fine, buy more dollars. I know plenty of financiers that would be happy to buy their French government bonds or whatever government bonds that they happen to be selling. It's an empty threat. It's a nonsense. And anybody who's scared of that doesn't understand how the international financial markets work. And I'm sure the Saudis understand that too. And I hope it's just the wrong rumor, because it would be a very stupid thing for them to be playing around with.
So do you think that kind of bluster has any effect, or is it just something for journalists, really?
Well, I know that there's a lot of people inside the bowels of the European Commission and the US Treasury and various places like that that are all sort of scared of their own shadow. They're scared of the sky falling. But at the same time as they're sort of saying, and they don't want to do anything. They want to just action is riskier than inaction. You lose your job if something goes wrong. You don't lose your job if you do nothing. And I think that mentality, which you see the world over in all sorts of different situations, but that mentality is very unhelpful in this particular situation, because Ukraine is suffering huge losses, as we've seen with our own eyes on TV, watching those children crushed in that hospital in Kiev. And they need resources. They need resources for weaponry, and they need resources to rebuild the hospital and their electricity infrastructure and so on that Russia has destroyed. And we have custody of those resources. We have $300 billion of Russian central bank's reserves frozen in our custody that we can give to the Ukrainians. And for all of these Chicken Little people that are saying the sky is about to fall if we were to hand that money over to Ukraine, it's just morally wrong. It's factually wrong. It's politically wrong, and it's financially wrong. We should hand that money over. There will be no consequence other than sending a very strong message to a lot of bad actors in the world that if you invade foreign countries and you have foreign exchange reserves, we're going to confiscate them. And I don't think that's a bad message. I think it's a good message.
And this is something that you have wanted and campaigned for a while now. Are you getting any traction?
Well, originally everyone said it's a non-starter, that we can't take any of that money. And then as time has gone on, and as the war has carried on, and as the economic cost has increased, we're now in a situation where it's been agreed that the West can confiscate the interest on that money, which I think is a half measure for sure. But any money is better than no money. And eventually we're going to come to the conclusion, and I guarantee you, we're going to come to the conclusion that we need to confiscate all the money, because this war is not ending anytime soon, and Ukraine needs the money. And it's better for Russia to pay for it than for us. And of course, we're all going to have to pay for it, but let's grab some of that. Why should the taxpayers of Britain and the United States and France pay for Ukraine's defense when Putin can pay for it before we do?
Mm. You mentioned Alexei Navalny, the opposition politician, earlier. An arrest warrant has just been issued for Yulia Navalnaya, his exiled widow. She's accused of being part of an extremist community, and the stakes are so high for anyone who dares to criticize the Kremlin. Why has she been singled out now, do you think?
Well, first of all, it's the most sadistic thing that they could ever do. They kill her husband in front of the whole world. She's calling for justice, and now they issue an arrest warrant for her. That's just sadism, pure and simple. But most importantly, whenever they do that, and I've been subject to arrest warrants for a long time, and usually whenever they start like turning up the heat is because I've hit their Achilles heel somewhere, and she has too. The fact is that she has stepped into her husband's shoes. And she is now leading the opposition. Putin is scared of any type of opposition, and she's got a very powerful case. She is an aggrieved widow who wants justice, and I think a lot of people would respond very emotionally to that call, and a lot of people in Russia, and that's very scary for Putin. And so, of course, they're going to do this. This is a sign that her presence in her campaign means something, and it's also, thankfully, she's in the West where she can be kept safe, and so no one's going to arrest Yulia Navalnaya. But but it does show that her presence in her campaign is threatening to Putin.
You've made it your life's work to pursue corruption and to corrupt people linked to the Kremlin. Just to go back to that mention of the frozen Russian assets, $300 billion worth almost. If you're successful in that campaign, do you think that will stop Putin? What effect do you think that will have on him?
I think it would be a game changer. War is all about resources. Russia has resources from the sale of oil. Ukraine doesn't. So every time Ukraine needs resources, they've got to go hat in hand begging to the West. And we give Ukraine some resources, but not enough. And I've heard it stated explicitly by officials in the U.S. government that the United States wants to give Ukraine enough so they don't lose, but not so much so they win. And the only way to stop this is to give them everything they need to win. And if Ukraine had that money, they could buy the weapons that they need to win. And it's not a certainty that they would win from that, but I can tell you something, that the moment Putin started hearing about the idea of confiscating that money, he starts, throwing out the nuclear card. He's ready to threaten nuclear war over that. If he's so upset by that, it shows that that's something that would really change the dynamics of the situation. And so we should absolutely do it without any question.
A couple of times while we've been talking, you kind of alluded to the time it takes for things to progress in the direction which you would like them to do so. When will you consider yourself to have done your job?
Well, unfortunately, my job becomes a bigger job and a bigger job and a bigger job. I started out with the mission of fighting for justice for Sergei Magnitsky, and then Boris Nemtsov was killed. And now we need justice for Boris Nemtsov. And then Vladimir Kara-Murza is arrested. And then Alexei Navalny is killed. And then other terrible things happen. And of course, none of this is to mention the unbelievable heartache and pain and death that the Ukrainians are suffering. And so it kind of feels like it's never going to be done because there's just so much work to do. And you kind of once you start to sort of fight evil metastasizes, and there's just a never-ending stream of problems to address. And that sounds very pessimistic, and unfortunately it is. The world is a very unfair and terrible place, but it's also, from my perspective, I used to be a hedge fund manager, and I would say it's infinitely more satisfying fighting for justice for victims than it is fighting for money. And so I don't in any way dread the job I'm doing. I rise up every day and with full energy to do my job.
Bill Browder, it's good to speak to you. Thank you very much for your time. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.